But there was a glorious period, obviously, where he transcended and became, for a lot of people, football's first sort of pop star.
The fact he was enjoying it so much that he gets to come back and play with two genuine legends of the game, and two, let's be honest with you, people who enjoyed post-match as much as they enjoyed match. Elton John being a part owner, and of course Elton John in the 70s, another carouser, could have been a massive part on George making that decision that he's going to become one of the pioneers of the American game.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of If You Know Your History with me, Jonny Owen, and
I'm Mark Webster, Californian beach bum.
There you go, a man with no middle name, like our the subject of our podcast today.
Like all the finest folk, John.
There you go, there you go.
Sorry, Jonathan Tudor Owen.
I asked for that. Just to let you know, obviously, we keep forgetting to say this at the top.
Yes.
You can subscribe to us, follow us, download us. Yeah, it's all free. And please share us. Let your friends know about this very educational, enjoyable podcast.
That's right. I mean, I'm learning as I go along, and we could really do with any input as well, because this is the whole point about this stuff. We're opening cans of worms left, right and centre. So we bring us information, we'll talk about it.
Worms galore. Today's episode is going to be about one of the most famous footballers that ever graced the game.
He did.
It is, of course, Northern Ireland's most famous son,
George Best. And the thing about George Best, we're focusing on the reason I describe myself in those rather grandiose terms, although, of course, I've got the body to back it up as a Californian beach bum, is his time on that particular west coast of America.
Yeah.
Which I think he enjoyed.
He did. I mean, it's well documented, George's later battles in life.
True.
But there was a glorious period, obviously, where he transcended and became, for a lot of people, football's first sort of pop star.
Yeah.
And I think that's fair to say. We've seen it in our generation with someone like David Beckham. Somebody becomes front page, and George certainly did that.
Well, you told me his nickname, El Beetle, and that says it all, doesn't it? Because if you're being named as one of the most famous four people on the planet, as being like the fifth guy, then that basically establish him in that position, doesn't it?
And he was an extraordinary looking human being.
Yeah.
He looked like a rock star.
He did.
He was what you would say, and I'm very happy to say this as a man, a beautiful looking man.
Yes.
He had very green eyes, black hair. He was lithe, the way he moved, everything about him. And I always remember my Auntie Sandra. Everybody's got an Auntie Sandra.
Yes.
My Uncle Philip's wife. She said she became a Manchester United fan and she used to go and watch him whenever she could, her and her friends, just to see George Best.
The first pin-up footballer for that reason, I would suggest he probably was. And so blessed with a head of hair that carried every haircut that he chose to go with. Yeah. He starts out with a pretty controlled, modish, short haircut, doesn't he? Yeah. But when he goes full 70s with the sideburns, it's still working. Well, and even the beard was great.
He looks like he could have stepped off, like I say, an album covered by the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin as they went into the 70s. There's a brilliant bit of footage, Mark, of him. I think it might even be top of the pops. 1965, the Rolling Stones are doing The Last Time. And it's a young Jagger, Richard, Brian Jones with them. And it cuts to the crowd, and there's a young Georgie Best dancing to the Rolling Stones in London in a studio. And the ident comes up, George Best.
Yeah, because he's as big as the lot that are on stage that everyone's there
Sums it up.
Makes perfect sense. And yeah, I had to say, I saw him once. It was in the executive boxes at QPR, and he walked past me, and he was diminutive. As super successful footballers go, he was surprisingly small. But then again, a lot of footballers can surprise you with that. But I think this is so much part of the nature of his game. Yeah. He was so difficult to tackle. Yes. Because he just had this ability to stand up.
To ride tackles. Yeah. Do you know, just this week, somebody put a compilation reel together of the 1968 European Cup final of him getting kicked. And without exaggeration, that man was volleyed all over the park. And every single time he jumped up, the referee ran to him, shouted at him as if to say, I'll take care of it, because Best would obviously go, they're kicking me all over. Yes. And not one single player was booked for kicking him.
No, that's right. And patently, it was a tactic, wasn't it?
It was like it was George's fault for being too good.
Right.
The referee stopped.
Going round, guys.
Yeah, this big Portuguese lad is going to kick you up in the air.
It's going to happen.
What are you thinking?
It's the nature of things. The reason we're talking about the LA is because, obviously, what a life. But is because he arrives at going to Los Angeles off the back of an extraordinary run of football clubs.
Yes.
Starting with leaving his beloved Man United.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I know people out there, George Best is worth 5 episodes of this. So we are going to do his early life, his early story, because I think the reason why George is such a fascinating character and such a complex character, he comes from such a fascinating, complex part of Great Britain.
True.
You know, Northern Ireland is well documented. Certainly, the 20th century had its problems.
Yeah.
You know, strangely called the Troubles. You know, it's like that, almost like a sort of throwaway name for something which was a civil war. Just in a place just across the water from us.
Always too quaint a description.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Personal taste,
and if you grew up like me and Mark did, you know, our news every night was sort of filled with these horror stories, you know, like you see now in other parts of the world, from just across the water.
And that's
there
the world
he
was born and grew up in.
He was born into that, you know, and it's something we do have to sort of quickly sort of describe because it was so influential on his character. And as Mark said, how he became so nomadic after, because he left a very, very tight community. You know, he was part of the Protestant Northern Irish. You know, a quick potted history. Everybody knows after the Irish rise in the 1916, you know, they was divided. They were the North. That was created to create a Protestant sort of majority that would keep people in power. He was very much part of that. His family were involved in Orange marches. I mean, he wasn't particularly political himself, George Mark, but he did grow up in that environment, an area of Belfast called the Craigie estate, one of those post-war sort of modern buildings, but an area of Belfast called sort of East Belfast, which is very Protestant. Okay. West Belfast would be the area, Mark, of what you call the Falls Road.
So there were lines of demarcation clearly, wasn't there? Yeah,
massively. And he came from there, but he grew up in a period of what we would call relative peace.
Yes.
So after the Second World War, there was a period in the 50s where it's reasonably peaceful. Everybody kind of knew their place. But this was going to change by the 60s, because what happened in the 60s was you saw the rise of the civil rights movement in America.
Yes.
Where, you know, people quite rightly were going, if I'm an African American, why don't I get the job or the house? And this happened in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
The Catholic population in Northern Ireland started saying, how come I'm discriminated against? The RUC, which is their police force, was Protestant, the judicial system, and George was part of that side of it. That's just a fact.
Right.
So he grew up in this environment. In this early 60s, when he was still just about a lid on it, he gets taken to Manchester. Yeah. He gets discovered very famously by a really famous Belfast scout called Bob Bishop, who sees him at 15 years old playing on the fields of Craigie, which is now a protected area, that field, which is lovely.
Oh wow! Yeah, because of Best.
Because of Best and all that. You can't build in it, which I think is brilliant.
Yes.
But you know, George Best is seen, and this guy Bob Bishop says, "I think I found you a genius."
And we are talking about a schoolboy.
Yes.
I mean, so it happened a lot in those days, but it feels like this was quite the trip for a young boy to leave his country and his family behind.
Well, his father, Richard Dickey Best, who didn't die that long ago, actually. He sort of outlived George, and his mother, Anne Best, you know, bless her, she suffered from well-documented alcoholism.
Yes.
A lot brought on, they said, by George leaving because there was such a tight-knit family.
Right.
It was just unheard of. And he famously goes to Manchester. The chief scout, the legendary Joe Armstrong of Manchester United, he's the bloke who finds so many of the players who were the Busby Babes in the 50s, and he's seen as the best scout, certainly in British football. He goes to see him, and he goes, yeah, you know, this kid's for me. Of course, finally Busby comes in, and he goes, absolutely, this guy. And they ship him across to Manchester, and he only lasts 24 hours, I think. Famously goes home, doesn't he? Yeah. He's so homesick. He's like, this is not for me. And Busby then gets in touch with the family, and they put him in with a really famous landlady called Mary Fullaway, who becomes famous in her own right.
Yeah, because she kind of
mothered him.
And she's part of that system, isn't she, as well?
It's a fabulous story. I believe there's a play being written about it. It's the story of Mary Fullaway and Anne Best. Anne Best losing her beloved George, and this other woman becoming like his surrogate mother in Manchester. But you know what's great? Again, these links with this podcast. Because he's Northern Irish, right, Mark, they're not allowed to have an apprenticeship by English football teams.
What?
You have to get a job until you're of a certain age. I know. And he goes to work.
A British footballer?
Yeah, I know. He goes to, the rules apparently, this is an Irish FA rule. He then has to found a job to keep him there, and have a guess where he goes to work? As a clerk in the Manchester Ship Canal.
Oh, I bet he spent many hours with a pen in his hand, didn't he?
But that bloody Ship Canal again.
I know. It gets everywhere.
Up. He's 2 years as an amateur. But he's seen as a guy that's pretty much gonna come through. And you know, I'm gonna ask the question, you know, and we're gonna sort of come back to it a bit later because I'm gonna go through the clubs in a second. But he has a really famous debut, right? When he's 1963, the 14th of September. This is a really famous date because it's George Best's first game, and he plays against West Brom, and he plays against a Welsh defender right? And I'm going to ask you, I'll tell you the name of this guy, because this guy's got a fascinating story himself. But this Welsh defender, he turns him inside out, Mark.
Does he really?
Oh, he ruins him. And this is the moment.
You know, before the game, that Welsh boy's getting that. Look at that.
Yeah.
He's 5'1".
Who's that little slip of a fella there?
He's not going to get a sniff. And he never saw the ball.
Oh, George, to use a football parlance, George ruins him. This poor Welsh lad. But this Welsh lad has an interesting story, and I'll tell you his name second half, and I'll tell you a little bit about his story. But anyway, George is in Manchester. We're going to come back in much more detail on his Manchester United career, because that in itself is worth, I don't know how many podcasts. But it washes out that, because we're interested in the LA years, it washes out that in 1974, he's kind of in an awful place. He's going missing. Busby's long gone as the manager, but Busby keeps coming back and forth, but he's gone through a few managers, Wilf McGuinness, Frank O'Farrell. It's not working for him. No. George often says, I felt, and this is understandable, that in 1968, when he wins the European Cup, Mark, he's a young man, okay? He's still in his very early 20s. He's the European Player of the Year. He's had a sensational game at Wembley against a brilliant Benfica team with team with Eusebio. And he felt the next season that there was a feeling in United, because Busby, remember, 10 years before, which we've spoken about, has got over has experienced the Munich Air disaster. Munich, 10 years later, one of the great stories in football, he wins the European Cup. And he felt that first season back after 69, that it was all done then. We're okay.
I see he'd done everything he needed to do, kind of, which is that's no attitude to have at 23 or something, is it?
Yeah, so that's the club, not him. He's going, I'm ready to start again.
I want to go again.
Yeah, but he's feeling that Busby, quite rightly, has gone, I'm kind of done now. You know, I've invested all this emotionally. I've achieved what I wanted to achieve. It's 10 years on the anniversary. And he did retire that year.
Yeah.
Busby, he said he's done.
And best is champion at the bit.
Champion's back at the bit. And there's no real idea of who's going to come in. And, there's no hunger in the club. And it's a downward, and more they rely on him. The weight is heavy on his shoulders. He's become super famous. He's got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
He likes a drink for the first time. And by 74, we're getting you pretty quickly. It's pretty much, he's going missing. Have you seen that video of the presser camp around the flat that he's in of some lady?
He just basically kind of locks himself away to try and avoid it all. Yes.
It's awful. And I think Tommy Dock comes in at this point, and he plays his last game for Manchester United in 1974. And that's it.
And surprisingly, sacked, which is an unusual thing to hear of a footballer.
Yeah.
I mean, contract terminated and all that kind of idea. They basically just got rid of George Best.
6 years after he wins the title, Mark.
I know.
After the European Cup, 6 years after he wins the European Cup, Mark. 137 goals, 361 games. He's 27.
They've given up on him.
They've gone, we can't do anything more with him.
Yeah.
It's so sad. And then, do you think, we've got the well-documented stuff that happened with Gaza, but do you think that would have been allowed to happen today?
No, because I don't think it would ever have got to that stage. I think whatever happened, what would have happened is they would have realised they still had a genius, and that he'd been on a contract, and that contract would have been honoured, and perhaps it does get broken a year later, but it's a contract.
Yeah.
And so George comes out of it in good shape, and he gets another proper club, is what happens today.
Yeah.
He gets sacked by Man United and then doesn't kick a sensible football in earnest.
Really?
For several years, really.
Well, yeah, you'd say that was kind of it. There was we'll come to a brief renaissance at Fulham, but and just touching on that, I remember saying to the great John Robertson once, who's the best player you played against? And he just goes, George Best.
George Best, simple as that, yeah.
And I was like, tell me why. And I thought, I'm hearing from somebody who, who's achieved everything in the game themselves, brilliantly gifted player. And he went, Jonny, he said, it's just hard to explain to you, but the boy could do anything.
Yeah.
He said he was both-footed, exactly what you said, ride a tackle. He tackled himself. He was brave, quick, balance, head a ball.
Yes.
He was like, Jonny, he said it was just, and he said the ball just constantly sort of gravitated towards him.
Box in the box, winger, tackle back.
Yeah.
He did 20 jobs that he didn't need to do on the field of play.
Yeah. And he said he was just, and he said, and I love Robert, he said, and I couldn't stop looking at him.
Even he knew that's a good looking boy as well.
Yeah, and I just love the fact that he sort of had that aura. Anyway, sadly, 74, it's done at Manchester United.
Yes.
Him and Tommy Docherty, and we'll mention this a bit later on, fell out forever. George does have a little bit of a sort of a return battle with him a bit later, but he goes to Dunstable Town.
Naturally, it's the logical move.
28, he's playing for Dunstable Town. You think it was a Stockport County in 75, Mark? I'm just going to run through this because I think
the list of names is nuts.
Because it just brings it home what it's like. 75 is Stockport County. 76 he goes played with Cork Celtic. I've never even heard of Cork Celtic. Cove Rangers, we have Cork Celtic. No. 76 is the stage is starting to kick off. So he's over in LA Aztecs, and we'll come back to that. 76, he also has this beautiful little renaissance, which everybody will know about, in Fulham. Basically because of something we've spoken before. HTV, by the way, ITV turned up there. It would have been one of the London thing because Hereford played Fulham and Brian Moore introduces a game. Do you remember where him and Rodney Marsh basically have the best fun ever at a football match?
They start tackling each other and they're in the same team.
The big match.
It was Bobby Moore, Rodney Marsh and George Best. And the great thing about it is that he came back and had a decent, I thought 40 games, I think he played something like that. So he played a proper season, but it was sandwiched between these two effectively careers in Los Angeles.
Yes.
So this is why I think these were happy years for him, because I think and we'll talk about his life in LA now, but the fact he was enjoying it so much that he gets to come back and play with two genuine legends of the game and two, let's be honest with you, people who enjoyed post-match as much as they enjoyed match.
You mean Bobby Moore, isn't it?
Bobby Moore and Rodney Marsh.
Yeah. Two decent players, I'd say.
I mean, those three guys that you get to go and watch them at Fulham for a season. That must have been special.
They were getting like 28,000 crowds. I mean, it's a fourth division game, I think, against Hereford. I might be wrong, but I think it was fourth division. Certainly third.
Yeah.
If not, maybe third then. But my favourite bit about this, if you watch it, and it's on YouTube, have a look at it, right? This sums up what George Best and what he'd bring to a game. So you got Brian Moore introducing him, and as he's talking, it cuts to his girlfriend at the time, model Angela McDonald James, who's taking photographs for the day in the tunnel. And it cuts this beautiful woman who's just taking photographs of the team and then runs out onto the pitch. And I'm thinking, only George.
Soon to be Mrs. Best, a little bit down the line when they go back to the States, correct. But of course, that's where he ends up. He ends up, as you point out there, getting signed by Terry Fisher to the LA Aztecs.
Yes.
And I get the impression, John, that Elton John being a part owner, and of course Elton John in the 70s, another carouser, could have been a massive part on George making that decision that he's going to become one of the pioneers of the American game. They've had a couple of goes before, haven't they? But this is the latest iteration of America being soccer, a soccer nation.
Well, and also just a quick shout out to Elton John, Mr. Dwight.
Yes.
Because a genuine, bona fide, massive football fan.
Watford till he dies.
I'm adored at Watford, quite rightly, to this day. But, I mean, just loves the game. You know, Joe, big friends with Best and all those people that went over to America in the 70s. And just quickly met my missus in a do, Vicky McClure, and said to her, my first cousin scored the winning goal for Nottingham Forest in the 1959 Cup final.
Wow.
Which he did. Roy Dwight was his cousin, right? He's Reg Dwight, isn't he? First cousin. To which Vicky went, I'm a Notts County fan. I was like,
suck the joy out the room, woman.
Take the baton. Elton wants to be your friend. So Elton John, as far as if you know your history is concerned, football legend.
We're all over him, and thanks very much for Elton. And of course, him being the guy that did that, and George gets to go out there, also working with Rhinus Michaels and Johan Cruyff.
I know
at some point as well. But my favourite of all the guys that were in there. So I'll just tell you about this bloke. Other Brits that featured, Ron Davis, the big Welshman.
Yes.
Terry Mancini, who became a brilliant TV pundit, played for Arsenal, QPR. Him and his brother run the Golden Gloves pub, Hammersmith. And a guy called Chris Dangerfield. Didn't know about Chris. I want to be Chris. He was born in Coleshill in 1955. He was a Wolves youth player. Took up football in the States. The Las Vegas Quicksilvers, Team Hawaii...
Oh, yes.
Californian Surf, and then the LA Aztecs.
Oh, can I play for that?
We all want to just be Chris Dangerfield.
Let's just go follow him around.
By the way, I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame now with a team which is called, in San Jose, that moved from Golden Bay, where they were called the Earthquakes.
Yeah, I know.
They named a team after one of the greatest natural disasters that America's ever known.
That's like calling a team like the Belfast Icebergs or something.
Really?
Yeah, you wouldn't do that, would you?
It just doesn't sit well with me.
Just quickly, Mark, Ron Davis, you know what happened with him?
No.
So he ends up in Fort Lauderdale. He ends up a bit of a loner. stays in the States. Obviously, scored record goals for Southampton, didn't he? When in the mid-60s. Brilliant in the air. And I was reading a line about him where, at a physical time, was kind of bullied out to being a great striker. So basically, centre halves would stand on the back of his feet.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Went to America, ended up living in Fort Lauderdale. Some money was raised by Southampton fans because he hit bad times, bless him. But then they lost him again, and he died out there.
Well, lost to the world then.
Yeah,
which is a shame.
but I'm just thinking, like, Ron Davis. So these people that went to America, some never came back.
No, it is. But hopefully, a lot of the time for good reason.
Yeah,
because like Chris Dangerfield, he's lauded
made a life out
in
there.
The States. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, well, he's celebrated out there. I'm so excited about the George Best part of his life, not least of which is I went to his bar.
George Best
in
bar.
the 90s.
What's it called?
It was called Besties. It's now called the Underground, if you want to go there. And it's called the Underground because it's kind of got the livery of the tube system and embraces its the British culture part of it still. Yeah. But
did you wear a Mac in? London fog.
So get all your beers in a bowler hat.
Brown warm beer in a bowler hat.
And if you've ever tried to drink beer out of a bowler hat, you know how difficult that
With
is.
an umbrella off your arm.
Umbrella over your arm. The lid of that hat doesn't help the situation at all.
I say,
especially you're trying to hail a taxi at the same time. It really doesn't work. But he ends up with a bar called Besties in Hermosa Beach, and I need to eulogise Hermosa Beach. So when I was doing the basketball for Channel 4 in the 90s, it's like 96 to 99, so I was covering the NBA. And the first time we lived in New York, the first time we stayed out in California for LA Lakers games, we stayed Sunset Boulevard, right up in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Because it's basically living in Piccadilly Circus.
Right.
Didn't like it. And it's a long way from the airport.
Yeah.
Whereas you come out of the airport, turn left, 2 miles, you're on the beach.
Okay.
And there's little places called Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, and then you're on Muscle Beach, the most famous of them all. But they're all tiny little seaside towns.
Okay.
And I love a seaside town.
Yeah, you do, don't you? Oh. Is it as nice as Southend?
It's
on a par.
It's got a
not quite. Okay.
They ain't got a pier.
Okay.
So they're struggling. You can't really make. It's unfair to make those comparisons.
Yeah.
You walk out your hotel and you're in somewhere real.
Right.
And I think that's what appealed to me. But that's what appealed to George Best.
Yes.
Best, he wanted somewhere to go where he could drink a lot.
Yeah.
And quietly, and basically he just took on his own bar. And so it's called Besties, and I visited when it's Besties. It's directly opposite as well, which made I was walking along. We were walking along a film on the beach, and I saw a back of a building. I said, "Good God, that's the cover of one of my jazz albums by the legendary Hammond organ player Charles Ireland." I won't do jazz here.
Yeah.
But that was because this was a place called the Lighthouse, which was one of the most legendary West Coast jazz places in America. Started in the 50s. Chet Baker used to be resident there. And there it was, in a car park, obviously at Bestie's bar. But the great thing about this hotel, so he ends up there, that becomes his haunt. He's got this kind of almost perfect lifestyle now, playing football there as Tex, and then just crashing in his own bar, where he had his own little corner where he could see what was going on but be a little bit discreet.
Yes.
But apparently one day he gets a little bit carried away and ends up launching his glass at a mirror and smashing the mirror.
Right.
Bit of a bad day, tidy up, send George home. A few years back, it was a long time ago now, it's 2005 when he died, the story goes that they're in the bar as the Underground now, they're watching the funeral of George Best on the big TV, and there's a new mirror which has replaced the one that he smashed up. And as they're watching the funeral go on, the mirror falls off of the wall and smashes.
What a perfect place to sort of
I ain't saying
this part.
Nothing.
George is still around. The presence of George.
But will he be there in part 2? I suspect he will.
Hello and welcome back to the second part of If You Know Your History, and we're talking about somebody that needs no introduction at all, George Best.
Indeed, George Best that basically did the right thing, and he helped light up American football. It had a real go when he turned up, didn't it? It was Pele obviously was massive being there, Johan Cruyff being there as well. But George Best was definitely part of this kind of rolling circus that gave soccer genuine impetus in the States at the time.
I think they felt in the late 70s that it was really going to get traction because, like I said, they give it everything they could in those first few years. It kind of fizzled out.
Yeah.
I think the problem is, I quote my grandfather here, the late Gwyn Owen, no middle name either, Gwyn, but he used to say to me, "You can't beat history, son." And what he meant was, like, if something's got history, like football as in this country, like American football and basketball as in America, it's really hard to get past that.
You'd argue that the reason that they're thinking that David Beckham et al. Are making a better fist of it now and the US have got a decent football team is they hung on in there and created history.
Yes.
Because, as you say, you can't have history if you don't put the time in.
No.
And so they've done that across the decades.
Yeah, they've had a go. Nobody goes there in their prime, though. That's the problem.
No. And a lot of the time when you look at their records and you look down and see the teams they play for, often one of the team names is in brackets and it says indoor league. And I always think they say, you'd be pretty much, let's call it something else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, talking about footballers who travelled after they'd left sort of clubs that are more traditional, I asked a question.
Who is this poor man?
Georgie Best's famous debut, age 17, the 14th of September 1963. And he played against a Welsh defender whose name was Graham Williams.
Okay.
Graham Williams, what a story this guy's got. He was later assistant to Bobby Gould.
Okay, it makes sense.
Yes, scored, sorry about this, Mark, in the League Cup final for West Brom against West Ham.
Did he now?
66, yes. And he ended up,
for that.
he ended up playing for, and I love this, and managing. Oh, I was like looking at, I don't know, did you triple check something going,
this can't be right.
This can't be. He went to Finland to play, Mark.
Wow.
Yes, he did. And he ended up playing for Rovaniemi Palloseura, known as ROPS of Finland. And one
Even to Finns, probably.
Yes. And one of the only teams, I probably think the only professional team at the time to play within the Arctic Circle.
And because obviously the big problem of Finland, they turn out every now and then a very entertaining international teams. But it's very difficult for them to maintain what you would call a genuine professional football league, isn't it?
But I know. But this team were a successful part of that thing.
Yeah.
So it was. I went to Sweden just for Christmas, and there's a Jokkmokk is the lap capital of Sweden. And this place, I won't try and say it again, is the lap capital of Finland.
Okay.
So it's kind of got a bit of, it's got a civic sort of place. And they competed quite well until 2011. But in 2011, Mark, the Finnish National Bureau investigated them for match fixing because a Singaporean businessman by the name of Wilson Paj Peru Mal, 9 players were found guilty and 24 games were considered manipulated.
So, to be fair, if you're going to manipulate, you might as well do 9 out of the 11. That's not bad.
But they were relegated to the Finnish third.
Oh, dear.
I love this, to the Finnish third division, Mark, which is called the Kakkonen.
Is it now?
So they're down there. But this is the side note for me.
Purgatory, that is.
This team had a bit of history that Graham Williams played for and managed. And I love the fact this happened, right? They won the cup and they got to the 1987-88 quarterfinals of the European Cup Winners' Cup. They got to quarterfinals.
Oh, wow.
And it was the same competition that one Merthyr Tydfil got knocked out by Atalanta. So they were in the same competition as Merthyr Tydfil.
Wow, they were that adjacent to your hometown.
A team playing in the
As
Arctic.
indeed, apparently everything is.
Well, I was going to say, my mates would laugh at this and say, a team playing within the Arctic Circle is very similar temperature-wise to Merthyr in the winter.
That's right, yeah. But have you done it on a cold Tuesday night in Finland?
As my mate said once in Merthyr, it doesn't get above freezing in the winter before 12 o'clock. Anyway.
We'll keep playing until it gets dark.
There we go.
6 months.
I just thought it was a great side note that Graham Williams ends up playing in the lap capital of Finland.
I do like that. I also should point out the fact that, talking about American boys, well, first of all, we need to deal with the fact that you've said Merthyr, I've got to say Southend. We mentioned Angie was, at the time, a girlfriend who came back to England with George, went back to the States and married him ultimately. They married in LA in 1978. Callum was born out there, of course, 1981. Angie, he met her at the signing party, basically in LA. She's out there working. She was a Playboy bunny, a model, a personal trainer for the likes of Cher and Sharon Stone, no less. But really, the only thing that matters is that, she's having a nice time on the West Coast in California, but she's from Southend.
Is she? Good girl.
So she basically lowered her standards, but it worked for her in the end.
Yes.
Good for her.
There we go. Everybody listening to this will be going, they're always getting Southend and Merthyr Tydfil. But there were very legitimate ways there. I mean, who'd have thought George Best would be connected to Merthyr Tydfil?
I didn't make Angie Best get born in Southend. I mean, I don't quite remember even now how you got Merthyr in. But no.
Well, Graham Williams went to play in Finland.
Oh,
of course. How
silly of me.
The team that he played for was in a competition with Merthyr Tydfil. Merthyr Tydfil could have played them.
That's only fact adjacent. When I just my last mention of Hermosa Beach here is I was again there in 1996. We were filming in a hotel with the Hudlin brothers who made the House Party films, and they just had film out when we were there, Great White Hype, which was Samuel L. Jackson film. It's a spoof on boxing film. And on the big screen, so this was the 6th of April 1996, we mentioned America having a go. On the big screen was the inaugural game of the MLS season.
Okay.
The San Jose Clash versus the groovy ones, DC United. Do you remember they had the black kits?
DC United.
Very smart looking.
First San Jose Clash. Is that like, was Joe Strummer involved in it?
That's right, yeah.
Their badge is a guy with a guitar smashing a football.
Exactly, that's right, yeah. Well, yeah, they just straight down the Westway and keep going 5,000 miles and you'll get there in the end. But the big name was they had John Harkes was playing, who had a really decent career in England, mainly with Derby, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
So he turned up at West Ham. And so they're lauding John Harkes at the start of the game.
Right.
And they're going, here he is, a man who's got all the experience. And then John Harkes is basically in the centre and he's kind of there and he's bent over double doing a sort of hamstring stretch.
Yeah.
And they kicked off while they were looking at his backside. So the MLS season started on John Harkes' bottom.
Well, do you know, this ties in quite nicely about George. I mean, this is what George was like, you know, if they're loading John Harkes, fair play to him, like, do you know what I mean? But he, by 82, 83, he's not in great physical shape.
No.
You know, it's physical. There was an idea that he'd come back and play for Northern Ireland in the 82 World Cup. It didn't happen for him. It was such a shame. So Georgie Best never played in a World Cup final, never played in a major tournament, you know, like lots of other great players. It just passed him by. But he's still such an attraction. And in 1983, Don Megson, father of Gary,
Yeah.
he brings him to Bournemouth for a few games.
That's right.
And he plays for Bournemouth, and of course the crowds go through the roof because it's almost become, it's a bit like a circus. He's gone to Hibs in 1980. He's had this sensational game against Rangers where somebody famously threw a can towards him and he kicked it back. But for 20 minutes, he just decided to be the old George again and sizzled through the Rangers defence. Irving Welsh talks about it in a brilliant article about it. So there's these sort of like quick lightning flashes of the old George.
There were still great moments, weren't there?
He's still only like, you know, late 20s, early 30s
true,
this
of course,
point.
yeah.
So sad. But obviously he's had his well-documented problems with alcoholism. But then he goes to Bournemouth and then, of course, he goes over to Australia. Of course, you're going to go to play for the Brisbane Lions.
Wow.
And the thing was, they get him over there again and there's a big fuss about it. But there's two lovely bits to this story. So he's bankrupt at this point, George. So he's chasing the money, bless him. But he's getting these offers to play because the people who own these clubs, A, getting the publicity and B, getting the crowds. And it's actually turned out to be, you know, you'll make a bit of money from
everyone, the good thing is everyone benefits, don't they? The club, Best, fans.
Absolutely.
Everyone is a winner.
Because they all can say, go and see Georgie Best.
Totally.
So for 50,000 Australian dollars, he goes to play a handful of games for the Brisbane Lions. And of course, one of the games he plays up against, a team called Sydney Olympic, are managed by Tommy Docherty.
Oh, no.
The Doc, the man who finished him at Man United in
Yes.
1974, last game famously against QPR. He says, I can't cope with you anymore. He's washed up in Australia as well. Mark, this game has huge worldwide attention because it's Best versus Doc.
Will they, won't they?
Yeah.
Shake hands,
Will they shake
acknowledge
hands?
each other?
What's going to happen? I mean, like saying that the story just follows George everywhere. It's just like he's like a magnet for it. You know, it's just like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Anyway, he plays this game and he wins, and he has a really good game. Of course, he does. Because even sort of that point, he's like, I got to win this. Still George Best. And Docherty sort of like hightails out of Brisbane. He's a bit disappointed. But the bit I love is the manager of the Brisbane Lions, a guy called Simon Kistermaker, right? He's Dutch. And of course, he's very serious about his football.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I don't want to go to stereotypes here, but the Dutch are very serious about their
Earnest.
football. Yes.
With the metal rimmed glasses.
Yes. And he's really disappointed by this circus. He doesn't want to be bothered with this nonsense. And he's like, he doesn't want Best to be there. But Best turns up, and of course, the money made from his crowds more than pays for his wages.
Right.
So the guy who brought him in turns around and says, look, he's made us some money. But this guy ends up going back to Holland. And in 1991, this guy, Simon Kistermaker, coached a team called De Grasford to the Dutch second division. And that team included Eric Ten Hag,
Good Lord.
who later became manager of Manchester United.
Yes.
So I was just like, these amazing things.
Never been to Merthyr.
There's these amazing little things that pop up. But there is one more game he plays, Mark. Oh, bless him. So in 1984, George Best brings the curtain down on an astonishing career. I mean, people shouldn't forget the early years of him winning titles. He wins European Cups. He wins, Balloon d'Ors, what they call now, World Player of the World Player, they call it now. It was European footballer at the time. He wins everything. He's sensational for Northern Ireland, brings joy to the game, changes football, El Beatle and that. But he ends up back in Northern Ireland, and the only team he plays for in a professional sense in Northern Ireland, Tobermoor United.
I like it.
They bring him in. It's in County Derry or County Londonderry, wherever you sit on the political divide. And they paid him £1,000, Mark, to play. And they lost 7-0
Oh, dear.
to Ballymena United. He's nearly 40 now. But, and here's the nice bit, all the players that played that day, what do they all talk about?
Yeah.
That they played with the great Georgie Best.
Because you can't beat that, can you?
You can't beat it.
Can't
Like
beat
Gwyn
that.
said, you can't beat history.
No, this is the way. Exactly, that's right, yeah. That's well said. And, of course, from that point of view, that old cliche phrase of him saying, well, the old where did it all go wrong?
Yeah.
And I know you've mentioned there, of course, there's a dark side to this and alcohol being a big part of it. But there's still that sense, you still get that sense that there was joy in the man.
Oh, Mark, 4,000 people turned up for that game.
And he's going to have loved it,
He's
isn't he?
going to have loved it. He goes on, it doesn't matter. People are loving Georgie Best. I just think there's something really interesting that just occurred to me when you said that, of him sitting in the corner. He was often, I think it was the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, but he also had a pub there, didn't he? A famous pub that he used to go to. It was somebody can tell us about. There would be a few in Manchester. But he used to sit in the corner, interestingly enough. And he used to do the same for a long time in his final sort of autumn years.
Yeah.
In Fulham, a pub in Chelsea actually called the Feeney Arms.
Right.
Where when he was still alive, people would say to me, you can go in there and George Best is sitting there. And people kind of like just respected him. He would read a newspaper, kept himself to himself. But George was happiest, either on a football pitch or sitting in the corner of a bar.
Sitting in the corner of a bar.
Just being left alone.
Just him. A happy, happy man. You'd say it was the stuff of Hollywood. In 2000, he took a spiritual trip back to LA.
Okay.
I can't find much about this. There was a feature film called Best.
Was?
Made in 2000. Great Irish actor. John Lynch plays George Best in it. He does the story. He co-wrote the script.
Famous In the Name of the Father with Daniel Day-Lewis. Great actor.
Exactly. George Best is script consultant on it, which is great news.
Yeah.
Patsy Kensit plays Angie,
Yeah.
who then goes on to be in the Big Brother house with Callum. Strangely enough, in sort of like...
Who we've spoken to. We've spoken to Callum.
Callum.
And a lovely young lad.
He is. And I love... And what he does is he really beautifully keeps the spirit and heritage of his dad alive.
Yes.
He really embraces that man. It's probably very difficult times as a young boy for him because there's a lot of moving about, and of course his dad has got those issues. But he chooses to celebrate his life, doesn't he?
I felt when we spoke to him, he was brilliant with us. There was a joy in his voice because we said to him, your father seems to get bigger with every passing year. The stories about him and the legend and the impact that he had, for all his faults, it was astonishingly positive in so many ways. And he said nothing brings me more joy now than that. And I'm going to end now with a little sort of Georgie Best story, because you've got to end with a Georgie Best story.
Gotcha.
Anyway, something. So talking about Northern Ireland at the start, because I think we can really go into more depth on his early years in future podcasts, because I think his Northern Irish upbringing was a huge part of his character, his personality. That amazing photograph, which I'm sure they'll find, of him being shaped around the ball when he can barely stand up.
Yeah.
And he is of that tradition of players that we often mention, Bobby Charlton, Wayne Rooney, where people knew that Johan Cruyff, they knew they were going to be footballers from the day they walked upright.
There's else happening.
There's nothing else happening there. You're going to be a top-class footballer. George was at the apex of this. This boy was seen as special from the very, very start. In 1971, when the troubles start, there's a death threat against him. So the IRA, because of his background, Protestant, they decide there's a death threat against Georgie Best. So he plays against Newcastle United. But the team bus, Mark, was broken in two the night before.
Good Lord.
They go to the game and George is told to lie in the aisle. So there's people with binoculars on the tops of the stands. Obviously, the IRA would have had snipers. The police would have had sharpshooters. George is on the pitch playing, and he doesn't stop running. He says, I have the game of my life, because he's thinking, as long as I stay up to this sight, I'll be all right.
Moving target. His stats for that game would be amazing. His chart is just red everywhere across
17
the
miles,
pitch.
yeah. So George is like laughing, going, this run. It was found after the rumour he donated to a Protestant group was complete nonsense. So he was never political, George.
Right.
It just wasn't his thing. But this is my favourite bit. So George says, he plays this game. They win 1-0. George scored. Of course he did.
Of course he did.
I think he's 71. He's George Best. He's
Yeah.
this one. He goes, but my favourite bit of this story, afterwards in the press conference, the Newcastle manager, Joe Harvey, jokingly said, I wish they'd shot the bugger. I don't know if you get away with that now, but I thought to myself, that's the humour of the time.
Exactly, and that was exactly the kind of guy that George Best was. He'll get you.